and I think, as you said, there was a question, no matter what the answer to that question is, no matter what we find, it's going to be really interesting. And you always sort of say, well, it'll be this interesting or this interesting, and I think we got pretty close to that higher bar and unraveled.
Gavin, tell us about the process that you went through. It was quite painstaking, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't that easy. It's a very secretive world, the hedge fund world and the polling company world. So, we had to talk to hundreds of people trying to persuade them to talk to us. It's in their interest not to really have this out there. So, yeah, we kind of went to hundreds of people and managed to persuade enough to talk to us that we could report it out. I think in our favor, there was certainly some disquiet in some of the polling companies that they were doing this. So that kind of helped us, certainly amongst the younger people. And some of the hedge funds as well, yeah. So that was a big help.
So, Kit, how was all this divided up? There seems like a lot of work there over an extended period of time. What sort of things did you each focus on, or how did you differentiate?
Yeah, Cam did all of it. These big projects require organization over many months, allocating resources to where they're needed. So typically any big investigative project, you'll have a very long list of names as the starting point. And so we made a huge list of people we might want to speak to. We made a long list of information we might like to get from other sources, including legal filings, information the government publishes. And we literally divided it almost in three, didn't we, I think? We each had a list of people to call. We tried to make sure when we did an interview, we had at least two of us present for the big ones. And that's how we did it.
Wow. Well, you may have noticed there have been a few stories about Donald Trump lately. The problem with many of them is they really aren't stories that have legs to them. They're sort of just a thing about him. So the story that was done by the Wall Street Journal reporters was really important because it actually was a story that had facts and figures and numbers and things to back everything up and really explained something that goes even beyond Donald Trump. And as a result, Michael Rothfeld, how did this start? In the cacophony of Trump stories, how did you go after this one?
Well, we basically followed the trail that started in 2016, even before the election, when we had gotten a tip that there was a lawyer who was running around the country paying off women for Donald Trump. And right before the election, we had reported that the National Enquirer's publisher had paid $150,000 to a Playboy model in order to protect Trump to buy her story but not publish it. And we reported then that this was known as catch and kill, because they're going to catch a story and then kill it for a friend, because the National Enquirer's publisher is run by a friend of Donald Trump's. So at that time, we learned also that another woman, Stormy Daniels, was also out there wanting to sell her story or tell her story, but didn't. But we didn't find out right away what happened to her. And so we just kept following that for another year, basically, until we learned that Michael Cohen, the president's personal attorney, had paid Stormy Daniels, the former porn star, $130,000 through a shell company to buy her silence just 2 weeks before the election.
And Joe, I think the terminology was used for what you looked into, the ecosystem. Ecosystem of what system? Explain what you were looking into and some of the perhaps seedier things you had to look into to try to get to the bottom of everything.
Yeah, this was not a world that we were familiar with jumping in, right? The world of adult film stars, of models, of scandal brokers, as we said in the video. It actually was a very traditional reporting task in that we were dropped into a world that was foreign to us, and we very quickly had to make sense of it and find the right people to talk to. And just like any other sort of industry, there are the middlemen, the intermediaries, the people, the connective tissue, the ones who dart, back and forth, and they have the broadest view into these worlds. And so we were able to find, a couple of those people who acted as our guides, right? They knew, who was going on what show when. They knew who was selling a story to whom. It's a business. It's a big business, and we did it, like I said, in a very traditional way. I mean, we put together spreadsheets. We dropped in as many names as we could find. We started with this lawyer, Keith Davidson. We looked at every case he was in, found his opponents. We found people who had been in business deals with him before. We were even calling, Donald Trump was in a softcore porn movie, and we called all the people in there. And one of those people was Karen McDougal. It was really a very, it was, like I said, a very sort of traditional reporting task in a very untraditional space.
Calling everyone who'd been in all of those porn films must have been
That's right.
Quite a day's work at the office, for sure. Alexandra Berzon, she was also involved in this. Now, she has won a Pulitzer of her own. She's not like a hanger-on or anything, but she's been mentioning that she's played a not as large a part in this as many of her own stories, but she is here. But you also dealt with a lot of it and had your byline in it as well. And tell us a little bit about what this type of story, how interesting it was, and how maybe different from some others.
Yeah, I mean, these guys have done incredible work. I was sort of helped out a little bit. I had been doing more so reporting on Michael Cohen and the Trump Organization. And so when it came to the person identified was Michael Cohen, which they didn't even know to begin with, then I kind of jumped in to offer some of that reporting on him and the Trump world, which is separate from the porn world. It's another ecosystem.
It was a very interesting discussion yesterday. So what advice might you have to those considering something? And so often people think that is too much work, or it couldn't be done, or somebody's done it. How do you discern what is a story worth putting 7 months into, or whatever time you put into? Any of you from the Gold Group?
Oh, goodness. I think, when you talked about the surprise factor, I think that's important. You don't want to just tell people something is worse than what they thought it was if you're going to invest a ton of time. I think in the case of what made the Journal story so great about Trump was it wasn't, it was completely separate from all the storm around Donald Trump, no pun intended, but because it was about paying hush money just ahead of the election in violation of campaign finance laws to win the election. That's what made it so extraordinary. So for them and their editors, I can imagine that was really what helped them get over the line in terms of deciding that they were going to go after it. In the project that we did, I think it was very much this idea that hedge funds were playing in the democratic process in these important democratic decisions. A lot of them had financed the Brexit vote, and we knew that they were trying to replicate this model of volatility in politics to make money elsewhere in the world, and we thought it was important to sort of to disclose it. Nobody had really disclosed it before, so.
And I would just add to that, there's a personal element to this too. If you have a personal feeling of curiosity about a story, if you're so fascinated by the first question that you ask that you can imagine spending 6, 7 months or longer doing almost nothing else, then there's a good chance there's going to be something to find. So for me, with this story, the idea that the polling companies that I'd seen on TV were making millions of dollars selling their information to hedge funds in secret, that question alone on day one was interesting enough for me to think, I want to know much more about this.
Michael, you had said that there was a lot of time spent going down lists of things and check. You were pointing out there is the dreary part of it but you must be alert, but you have to keep going. Tell us what that process was, what you're looking at.
That's right. When we first found out that Michael Cohen, we were very excited. We had one particular source who kind of told us the outlines of what had happened with the payment to Stormy Daniels, that Michael Cohen had made it, but did not tell us the amount of the money, or knew that it was paid through a shell company, but didn't know the name of it, only knew it had a name that, as we mentioned in the video, that something like damage control or some kind of funny, appropriate name, because, trying to damage control before the election. So, but we didn't know where that was, so we set about, before we, when you have kind of like a tip that is really good and competitive, if you start making phone calls, then you might, tell somebody in the outside world who could tell a competitor, and we didn't want to do that right away because we felt this was like a really exclusive piece of information. So we set about to look for the shell company that he had used, and we got records from 4 or 5 different states where people typically set up companies. Certain states allowed that to be done without the person's identity being revealed, and so we figured it would be in one of those states, and Delaware is the one we really focused on, and we just went through tens of thousands of shell company records, just scrolling through and looking for names like damage control or hush money, and we spent several weeks doing that, and we did ultimately find that company, and that helped us to corroborate what our source had told us.
The fact that this wasn't a typical series per se, but rather something that started and then snowballed and kept going and kept going, what does this say about the importance of doing stories in the first place that add to stories and more stories and more stories? It sort of happens that once you do something of interest, people think, oh, they're paying attention to this, and there's more to it.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely, and it builds on itself. When we write a story, we got information. You throw the story out there, and it pays dividends. People came to us, and that helped us advance our reporting. And it was really episodic. It was just sort of we were flying from one to the next and trying to build momentum and to keep going. We wanted to keep the story in the news because we knew we knew that there was more information for us to uncover, and we were concerned that if we let it go, if we lost momentum, that it was going to be more difficult for us to do.
What kind of barriers did you all run into? You must have run into some barriers. Where was the pushback on when you came up with your information or when you were trying to find it? Where was the biggest pushback that you encountered?
Well, for us, it was it was just difficult because in our first story it was basically on Stormy Daniels. We found an LLC, but we didn't have a copy of the contract that had been paid, so it was all anonymously sourced, and so that you have to be very careful when you're doing that. A, because you're relying on what people are telling you, and secondly, because you have some readers will question your credibility if you don't have actual documents. We had seen things and cross-checked information with various disconnected people that all matched up, and again we found the LLC that also matched up. But it was a challenge for us to get even internally the level of confidence that we needed to publish the story using the sources alone. And then after it came out, we did get a lot of readers who were supporters of Trump saying, well, you're citing this to people familiar with the matter, so why should we believe you? So that was the main pushback that we got. And ultimately we knew it was accurate, and it ultimately all bore out because people did eventually admit that this was what had happened.
It seems like two really significant parts of society now that we've been hearing so much about: polling and also suits in which you pay someone for silence. These seem to be drawn into question now. How has all of this affected the view of polling in your mind? We'll touch that one first. Does this add more questions to what people already have about polling?
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. And, I think the fact that it wasn't known before was because everyone was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. There were secrecy agreements for everyone who was involved in what we wrote about as well. Hedge funds were incredibly afraid of, being brought, of potential criminal charges or other regulatory charges. I think the pollsters were some of them had the sort of self-awareness to be worried about what they'd done. Some of their lawyers had advised them that they could do some things but not other things. They knew it was a legally sensitive area. But it has opened people's eyes in the UK and I think in other European countries, especially to the dangers of this, these secret alliances between people betting hundreds of millions of dollars in pollsters.
Because some people thought it was pretty cool and they wanted to try it themselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, when the polling companies are sort of informing the whole Democratic conversation about, are you going to vote or who you're going to vote for, and if they have these secret alliances for people who are betting on one side or the other that they're not telling the public about, that's kind of slippery ground.
What about these silence agreements? The Wall Street Journal experience, were these worth the paper they were printed on? I mean, what are those holding up now, or how would you view dealing with those sort of agreements? I think, Michael, you said you have to work around them as best you can and see what's possible. How did you do that?
Well, I mean, we, took the position. We're not bound by the agreement, as the people may be bound by them, but we kind of take the position that if there's an agreement that may bind somebody to something that isn't legal, or it's potentially shielding some kind of a crime that may be committed, or something that is in the public's interest for people to know, that that person might be, or people may be able to talk about them. And there also there also may be other people who can talk about them, who know about the non-disclosure agreement, like third parties who aren't necessarily bound by them. So that's an avenue that we used. Correct, Joe? Yeah, to get people to talk about them, just looking for people who know about them but aren't actually bound by them.
Joe, did you find that? Doesn't it seem like a lot of people bound by those are looking for an out to actually be able to break them in some ways?
I'm not sure. I mean, so just the state of play here is that both of those NDAs have collapsed, right? So Karen McDougal sued to get out of the AMI agreement after more than a year, actually, after our story ran, and then Stormy Daniels also sued, and Michael Cohen and Donald Trump have said they will no longer enforce that agreement. But these are these are two NDAs that were sort of masking, I guess, alleged consensual behavior. I say alleged because Donald Trump denies that he had an affair with either woman. After we reported it, there was certainly incentive on their part to want to be free of this thing. They wanted, we had sort of exposed the nature of it, and they wanted to tell their side of the story. I think that's a natural inclination. I think that in general, NDAs, we're just hearing a lot more about them, right? And we're hearing about them in the context a lot of time of masking sexual assault, sexual abuse. And I think that's a more complicated question. I think maybe the knee-jerk reaction right now is to say that those NDAs are bad things, but I think that thinking of the victims and compensation and everything, these are really complicated issues that I'm glad the country is talking about now.
Jim, how did you deal with some folks who, you use the example of the Howard Hughes stories. Tell us a little bit about, if everyone's familiar with Howard Hughes, well, go ahead.
What do you want me to say?
Last night
no,
you
I'm
were
just kidding. He was dead by that time, so it wasn't really much of a problem with him, of course. But actually, in his case, we had many years ago. Don and I wrote a series for the Philadelphia Inquirer on all of Howard Hughes's connections to the federal government. This is when he was still alive, and it was kind of an interesting series because he had the image of this rugged individual who hated to pay taxes. But here was like 90% of his empire was dependent on federal contracts and so forth. Anyway, and his influence of politicians, things of that sort. Anyway, after Hughes died, we expanded this into a full-scale book. But one of the things that was very tricky, everybody around Hughes was subject to criminal investigations because of the way he died. I'll give you an example of what that was about. He was 6'3" and weighed 94 pounds when he died. He had needles broken off in both arms. So the question was, did not exactly get the best care toward the end of his life. But what made it possible for us to tell the story of his last years so well is that everyone around him was subject to various depositions, criminal proceeding. A deposition is when you were sworn under oath to tell the truth to a lawyer. It could be a prosecuting attorney, it could be a defense lawyer. And these are very extensive documents that have the weight of testimony in court. So those became a very powerful way to reveal all the last stages of his life. And that gives me a chance also to say, a lot of things have changed in journalism, but I think all of us up here will agree that one of the things that has not changed at all, the courts on their various levels are this incredible source of information for journalists. They're still not used as extensively as they should. And we're in kind of a golden age of using the courts. Because when I was a young reporter, you had to actually go to the courthouse, or if it was another city, travel to that courthouse. All federal court records are now online. The dockets are online. Many of the depositions are online. Bankruptcy cases are online. Many state jurisdictions are doing the same thing. They at least have the dockets online. All kinds of things that used to be extremely difficult to get are now at our fingertips. Same with corporate records. Same with records of various jurisdictions. So what you can get from your computer today 24/7 is absolutely astonishing. Don and I years ago came up with a phrase because we use documents so much, records, that people say, well, you guys have done this so much, you must know where everything is. Well, we don't know where everything is. But what we adopted was something called a document state of mind. Now that's now morphed into a web state of mind, because things that used to be just paper are now on the internet as well. But we just assume something is out there until we're proven wrong. And I can't begin to tell you how often that turns out to be the case. But part of the trick is not knowing exactly what to look for, but just knowing that it's probably out there, and start your searches and see what you find. One last thing on this. We did a story on the airlift of cash in Iraq at the beginning of the Iraqi war several years ago for Vanity Fair. And in it, we found out that the federal contractor who was supposed to watch the airlifting of these millions and millions of dollars to Iraq, to keep track of it. In fact, his previous experience had been putting recreation rooms and bathrooms in San Diego County housing developments. Not exactly your classic auditor that we associate with projects of that size. But anyway, he obviously had a friend somewhere who gave him this contract. But anyway, the government blacked out almost all the details about this contract except his mailing address, which was a post office box in Nassau, the Bahamas, of all things. I mean, you don't normally think of federal contractors having post office boxes, mailing addresses in the Bahamas, at least I don't. Anyway, it turned out, by accident one day, in addition to all the chicanery involved with that contract in Iraq, we plugged in that address in Google, and up pops the document. I won't tell you all the details about this, but it showed that that same post office box was the locus of a almost $1 billion offshore tax fraud scheme. So here you have the same federal contractor operating off this post office box in Nassau that's the center of this other giant fraud. The point being, before the internet, we would never even have found that. But it just occurred to one of us, let's just, for the heck of it, plug in this number in Google and see what happens. And voila, there it was. So that's why what we can do today is amazing. It's just a matter of thinking ways that you can apply it. That was a longer answer than you wanted, wasn't it?
No, none of your answers are
Okay.
long. This is named for you. Come on. We were also now going to take questions too, so if you would just kind of, if you've got a question, to come up to the microphone here. And while we segue to that, Cam, I noticed when we mentioned the Barlett and Steele, you mentioned what an inspiration that Jim had been. I mean, he wrote a really nice letter about how excited he was. One of the things that goes with this is a private dinner with Jim, and you really shared your feelings. Tell me, what kind of inspiration was Jim to you?
Yeah, you know, when I was a young journalist, people didn't sort of, in journalism school or even out of journalism school, there was very little focus on money in the world. And money is, I think, as all of us would probably agree, is sort of the real power in the world. And it's also something that's been greatly overlooked, I think, in terms of what a powerful force it is and who the moneyed interests are and how they get their way. And Jim and Don really did more than any other journalist, I think, to make that a huge and transparent as they could factor in the world. And they wrote an extraordinary series for the Philadelphia Inquirer called America What Went Wrong in the early 90s, turned it into a best-selling book. There were 400,000 reprints that flew off the shelf of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I read it as a young journalist, and it was really transformative for me in thinking about the way the world really works and the power of money and Wall Street behind the scenes to sort of shape policies. They talked about, you know, the economy is not really this strange magical creature. There's our rules that are written down, and the game has sort of been rigged against ordinary people in favor of a handful of people on Wall Street and other companies. So that was really transformative for me as a journalist back then.
Well,
So,
a worthy role model, for sure.
yeah, no, absolutely.
Let's go to the questions. Jimmy?
Hey, my name is Jimmy Jackson, and I got a few questions. You guys talked about getting tips for your story as far as someone going around making payments on behalf of Donald Trump. How much of that is people wanting to tell their story through the Wall Street Journal, or how much of that is just, you know, having connections with people? And then my second question is, when you guys originally, I guess, started pursuing this story, did you think that it would become a huge deal as far as campaign finance violations, or did you just think that, you know, it was another story, you know, on top of, you know, a lot of stories that were already out in regards to Trump, you know, doing things illegal?
Good questions. So in this particular case, original tip that came in was it happened through a relationship or a connection, but it happens always. I mean, some tips come in anonymously, and a lot of information, and like the later information in our reporting on Stormy Daniels, like, just came through relationships that we developed during the reporting. So it happens all different ways. Your second question, I'm sorry, was about, just remind me that again, sorry.
My second question.
Oh yes, how big did we think the story would be? I mean, we knew it was going to be a good story. Like, we felt strongly that the president's lawyer paying off a porn star, before the election was a good story. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of news judgment to realize that. But, I had told, people close to me, oh, we're reporting on this, before it was published, just a few, close friends. And, their response was, oh, Trump can do anything, and nobody will care. And that was that was their impression. But, I remained optimistic that people would care. And in fact, they did. Although it did, there were various waves in this story where, it first came out, it was big news. And then just as we continued to follow it, it kind of got bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about your guys' story is that, the original story that you wrote in October 2016 was also an extraordinary story about Karen McDougal, and that didn't really get a lot of it wasn't really, I remember at the time thinking like this should have been a bigger deal to begin with, so, but anyway, so sometimes it doesn't.
Also, did you all have any reason to believe before Michael Cohen, pled guilty that Trump possibly was in on the payments, like through sourcing, or no?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Like, did you all have any reason to believe that Trump knew about the payments before Michael Cohen said it in court?
Yeah, so we did. It wasn't as firm of reporting as we wanted it to be, but actually his guilty plea and him standing up and saying that Trump directed him helped us get those final pieces, right? So we had Michael Cohen saying in court that he was directed. The Trump camp is saying this guy is a proven liar, and then because of it was reporting on it episodically all year. We had sort of been collecting pieces, and finally we got it. And just recently we did report on the upshot of the story was that he was involved in every phase of these payments.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, my name is Abdullah Jimenez. I am a senior at the Cronkite School. And so one of my questions for the journal team is to walk us through a little bit of what you had to go through to just understand the adult film industry, and what did you, how did you start pursuing that angle, and where did you, what did you have to do first? Because this is a very, very titillating topic, especially for journalists, right? That's something usually we never report.
Yeah, we had some really interesting internet search histories. But what I was saying before is that it really is, even though it seems like it's sort of risque subject matter, it really was the way that you would approach any story. We started off with one person in 2016, this guy Keith Davidson. We, essentially drew a circle around him, tried to identify all of the people that he had sort of associated with, because we had been told that he had made these payments. We built our source list. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, though, even though it was very literally a sexy topic, it was not actually sexy. The reporting. I mean, it's just very sort of it's the routine stuff. Using LinkedIn, finding the connections to people, looking up phone numbers on Accurate, creating databases. Must
be quite a LinkedIn you have now.
Yeah.
Point.
Yeah, it is. It's yeah, I'm very proud of it. But yeah, so I guess what I would say is that the skills that you develop just as a reporter, all reporting almost is investigative reporting, and we approach this the same way that we would approach any story not involving such material.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So a question for Bloomberg. How do you recommend people go about covering really complex topics like Brexit?
Yeah, this was a complicated story. You just have to start from the bottom and build from the base up. None of us are experts in the operation of markets or how hedge funds work or the data that goes into polling and how it's used. We had to learn as we went, and that's what we did. So you start off with a basic question. You try and educate yourself as you go along. A big part of that is still just speaking to people. Finding the prominent names within polling or politics who can explain to you how this works, what the basic situation is, and then as you go, you become more knowledgeable. So it's one of those things that it seems daunting at first, and there were moments in this process over many months where we felt like, maybe, are we understanding this correctly? Is this really happening the way we think it is? But the more people you speak to, the more you learn, and by the end, we knew our subject pretty well.
I think probably, this was a puzzle, and we didn't know we didn't have the box to show us what the final picture was going to look like, and that was really complicated. It was just the investigation itself was really complicated. The subject matter was complicated. I think the most important thing that we did was we kept track of every single thing that we learned, every document, every clip, every hedge fund letter, every bit of data, every interview that we did. We had every word. We had, our main interview file was probably just 2/3 of our interviews, and I think it was 40 or 50,000 words. And we would learn things later that we would say, oh, wait a minute, didn't someone say something about this 2 months ago because it took so long? And so we were able to go back and put the pieces together in a much neater way by just literally being insanely obsessive about everything that we gathered over the course of the reporting.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andre Scaraluz. I'm a senior at Cronkite. I was kind of, off of what Cam said, I was kind of wondering, with so much information that both teams were gathering from for these news stories, what was your way of collecting that data and making sure that it's in a place where you can go back to 2 months later and go back to something specifically that someone said?
We have a system in our office that's just called a note system. You can create a shared note. You can limit who gets to see it, and we created notes, around key subjects. We had an interview note. We occasionally would stray and share things via email, and then we would go crazy. Some days where we were like, "Wait, where is that?" We know we have this thing somewhere. But generally, we were pretty good about just obsessively keeping everything in our shared note system that we were able to access as we went. I think, was there anything else that sort of?
Yeah, well, it obviously obsessive note-taking, always take notes, always log them. If you have it in an electronic form, it's word searchable. So, if we were having a discussion about a specific aspect of polling, we would just search through our very large document to find all the areas where this thing had been talked about. And at the end of the process, when you've got all this information and you're piecing it together, you can find things that are echoed in 2, 3, 4, or 5 different conversations and be fairly confident that that's good information you can use in the story.
And then I had a second question, unless anyone else had anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, so actually we just use a souped up version of Google. That's our email system. And so we use shared documents, and we created spreadsheet after spreadsheet, right? So we had source lists, we had a list of transactions, every transaction involving Michael Cohen that we put together, property transactions that we put together, and you do have to be careful when you're putting notes into these Google Docs. It's not foolproof, and it's not as secure as having your notebook, right? Having it, so you need to make sure that you're protecting your sources when you are sharing memos with other reporters. But we are always working from a shared doc. When we write stories, we work from a shared doc. We just make sure you label and date everything so that we could call it up when we needed it. And these are reference tools that we still use to this day. We refer back to these reporting memos that we've written, these databases that we've put together.
Yeah, and Google Drive also allows you to word searchable in the search box. If you put a term, it will actually search all the documents, even PDFs. So if you are trying to remember something that you did a long time ago and you put something in, it'll kind of call up all the documents that have that term in it. So that's a very useful tool to have.
Let me add just one thing to that, and I think it's sort of understood what we've heard here. One of the most important things I found from day one is to not just read documents or read your interview transcripts or listen to them, but to reread and to re-listen. Because it's amazing when you go through a project of some size, very important things will emerge at different times in that process. You may not know their significance in the beginning, but when you go back and reread it, a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, boom, you can't believe it. It was there the whole time. But because you'd picked up some other information down the line, it then becomes very significant. So rereading is extremely important.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that wraps up our questions, but now the big event is the bestowing of the trophies. So first I'd like to, Jim and I will bestow the Gold Award to Bloomberg News for the Brexit short.
It's as though we never did this before.
Yeah, we never did. Every year we fumble around like
I know. Our hearts are in the right place.
Yeah, we mean well. There you go. Next, the awards goes to the Wall Street. That's it. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all for joining us this evening. As you can see, there's some journalists to truly emulate in your careers. So in the same way that Jim presented a role model for one of our winners in the gold group, I'm sure that some of these people can provide the same encouragement to you in your careers. Thank you very much for being here tonight.